Swatches of bright green pulsate and flicker with every movement I make. Each shape opens onto a string of light that's tuned taut with indifference, but broken in an instant. Stark, yet warm, all things run clear. Air feels close to light, everywhere, yet without resistance. There's a sea of sound. It contracts my attention as it crashes against it, erupting into a fine mist of 1,000 compositions. Movements hum a familiar tone that transformation knows by its own existence. Flows of bodies demonstrate that sense of freedom. Nothing is abrupt, but everything is new. I see a sign for a coffee shop and realize I better hurry or I won't be able to get my beloved coffee and be on time for work too. Look, I get it. I'm no poet. But what I'm trying to do here is tell you about an experience I had that escapes my ability to represent it. We will explore later how this fits in with Deleuze's concept of difference. For now, I want to suggest that this difficulty in representation is not due to poor memory or my subpar prose, well, maybe the latter a little bit, but rather because experience, at its core, is far richer than the representations we substitute it with. Most of our life, we are in a constant state of judging the world, recognizing and distinguishing its components, essentially, seeing it in terms of identities. Oftentimes, when I walk down the street, I do not experience the world as it appears, but rather see it in relation to the pre-established concepts I have of it. I measure it against and substitute it with what I already know. This is what I mean when I say we are caught in the domain of representation. This constraint of representation does not only pose a problem for communicating our experience to others, but also distorts, often without our knowing, the radical heterogeneity that is the condition for all experience. What I was trying to call up in the opening of this video was one of those rare cases where the world is experienced without preconception. This occurred one early summer morning while walking to work after having almost missed my subway stop due to being too deeply focused on Henry Summerhall's guide to Deleuze's difference and repetition. One of the many problems with my attempt at describing this experience is that I must use words and thus stable identities. But as it happened, there were no words or identities, no swatches of green, no flows, no lights or sounds. What there was pure, raw experience. The idle chatter that categorizes objects, that partitions one against their environment, was for once nowhere to be found. What was revealed was pure, fluctuating quality, or as we will discuss, difference in itself. Before we tie this in with Deleuze's concept of difference, I want to suggest one thing. I am well aware of the paradoxical nature of this terrain. I'm attempting to talk about that which escapes being talked about, for language is a form of representation. We will no doubt run into problems. We already have. In attempts to think outside of representation, I suggest that you hold my words lightly. Try to feel what is being palpated in order to allow the inevitable contradictions to dissolve. You might be asking, what does this personal account have to do with Deleuze's concept of difference? Well, what I just described was an experience in which the world appeared to me free of conceptual identities, which revealed the inherent difference of the world itself. At the same time, I saw this as an opportunity to show the difficulties in representing difference, hence my acknowledgement of the inability for words to capture what was actually experienced. Thirdly, the main point of this video is not to just go over Deleuze's concept, which I will do, but to also share with you the ways in which this concept and my meditations upon it have affected my life, of which this experience is just one instance. There are plenty of risks to this approach, of which I'll address later, yet my hope is that this personal account may help show the imminent relevance, beauty, and potential in Deleuze's conception of difference, and that maybe this angle might bring a new type of understanding to the topic. Before we go on to see how these concepts look within a life, I want to give a brief account of Deleuze's difference, touch on Kant's incongruent counterparts, and then use Bergson to help us further understand the paradoxical nature of Deleuze's difference in itself. Deleuze proposes a concept of difference that radically opposes our common notion of the term. In everyday thought, we find it difficult or even nonsensical to think of difference without understanding it as something that exists between things or in opposition. We ask, what is the difference? And are met with, between what? When we suggest a different approach, we imply and define that difference in opposition to the current approach. What happens when we do this? When we ask what the difference is between the mug I'm drinking out of and the mug you're drinking out of, we might note that there is a difference in size, shape, color, and so on. Yet, these differences, and any others you can name, are themselves identities. Difference, here, is founded through identifiable commonalities. It is a byproduct of sameness, an epiphenomena of identity. We have not touched difference itself. Many might ask, what is the problem with this? And for good reasons. It helps us navigate the world. I ask, can you grab my mug? And get a response, which one? I say the green one. We usually differentiate things through their attributes. But again, these attributes are themselves identities. The problem is that thinking in terms of identities or representations cannot account for how these determinations come to be, as they always resort to another representation. In other words, we cannot use representational thought to get outside of representational thought. This limits us greatly, as it confines us in a sense to what is already known. In response to this dilemma, Deleuze explores the possibility that there is a difference that precedes identity, that cannot be captured by representation. You may wonder, if representational thought cannot break outside of itself, how can we know about this primordial difference? The answer is that there are other modes of thought, namely, intuition. Intuition, as discussed numerous times on this channel in relation to Bergson, is an involved way of thinking that cannot be reduced to conceptual determinations or representations. It is in this non-representational domain that we become acquainted with difference in itself. I'm now going to give two examples of difference that cannot be represented conceptually, but that nonetheless can be known intuitively. After this, I will discuss how embracing and encountering this notion of difference opens up new possibilities for thought, and on a personal level, how it has changed my experience in the world. But first, let's look at Kant's discussion of incongruent counterparts to see an instance of how difference can resist any form of conceptual determination. In other words, to reveal a difference that cannot be represented. The philosopher Immanuel Kant first introduces the idea of incongruent counterparts in a work called Concerning the Ultimate Foundation for the Differentiation of Regions in Space. Now, I'm no Kant scholar, so I don't have a thorough understanding of the context of this idea or its larger purpose in Kant's philosophy. This aside, what interests us, and also Deleuze, is how Kant discovers a difference that cannot be grasped by conceptual representations. In a thought experiment where we are to imagine that all that exists is a single human hand, Kant comes to realize that we cannot describe its identity as left or right. What can we say about this hand? We can describe its internal relations. For example, the thumb is on the opposite side of the pinky. But any description that we can articulate or represent is true for both left and right hands. They are conceptually identical, yet we know that there is a true difference, as a glove for a left hand will not fit a right hand. We cannot represent the leftness or the rightness of a hand. One objection to this statement might be that this is merely a limitation of language. For example, can we not represent the leftness of a hand by, let's say, drawing it? At first, this seems right, but while the drawing may represent a left hand itself, it does not represent the leftness, as it actually has leftness within its appearance. The thumb is actually drawn on the right side of the hand, indicating that it is in fact a left hand. For us to recognize it as a left hand, we have to already have an understanding of what left is. We do not know the identity of a left hand by conceptual determinations, for they are identical in both the case of a left and a right hand. The way we know it is through intuition. Deleuze is interested here because it points to a difference that precedes identity. Now I want to direct our attention to Bergson as a way of further acquainting ourselves with difference in itself, and to tie it into our experiential approach. In observing the nature of immediate experience in his book Time and Free Will, Bergson comes to realize many things about experience itself. He notices that lived experience, as it happens, is radically different from how we tend to represent our experience to ourselves, retrospectively, after the fact. Of the many things he discovers about our immediate experience as it is lived, we are going to focus on his observation that experience is in perpetual flux. He might even say that our experience is perpetual flux itself. So if our experience is in perpetual flux, or is itself continuously fluctuating, what is it that changes? Does it mean that we go from one conscious state to another? This seems reasonable. I can name a huge amount of states I've gone through today, and it's only 10:48 a.m. To name a few, I was excited, bored, confused, overwhelmed, content, and hungry. If we are satisfied with this conclusion, Bergson might ask us to look a little closer. He might ask us how these so-called states actually appear in our immediate experience. For example, when we think of ourselves as confused, is it fair to call that confusion a state? I would argue that there is nothing static about confusion, or any other state for that matter. We aren't simply confused and then magically jump to another state. What is it like to be confused? It involves a continuous progression, an evolution. Our experience is changing. Various potentials of understanding are formulating. Roads are being traced, retraced, and combined, abandoned, some nascent, some prominent, each gradient resonating and evolving the whole. It becomes apparent that states are not in fact static blocks in conscious experience, but rather continuous flows of change. So we might ask the same question again. What is it that is changing in this flow we generalize as a state? One might conclude that what changes in a state is that each moment of our experience differs from the next. Again, Bergson would ask us to go further. What are these moments you speak of? What is a moment in conscious experience? Let's direct our awareness to our immediate experience as it is being lived right now, and see if we can find this moment. Try it. I don't know about you, but no matter how I try, I can't isolate some absolute unit of experience. What I might refer to as a moment, no matter how thinly I slice it, is itself a flow of experience. Experience always implies some kind of thickness. Now, what keeps this thickness from collapsing into an absolute point? If it were completely homogeneous, a sustain of the same, we would have no way to feel its duration. It must be itself a progression, a continuous fluctuation of difference. What have we shown here? We have shown in our search to find what it is that changes, or what differs, that is not things that change. For what we refer to as things, be it states or moments, are themselves composed of change. No matter how much we search for the elements or identities that give rise to the ever-changing nature of experience, What we are to find is difference itself, nothing behind it, nothing else composing it. Deleuze's statement comes to mind that difference is behind everything, but behind difference there is nothing. We find continuity without homogeneity, or as Bergson puts it, pure heterogeneity. Deleuze acknowledges Bergson's discovery of difference and formulates Bergson's concept of duration, a term for this ever-transforming nature of experience, as that which differs with itself. So far, we have explored two accounts of difference that are not between identities and cannot be directly represented. We are at a point now where we might ask, why difference? In many ways, this is an important question, but if we are to embrace difference in itself, we begin to see how questions like this are closely related to our old formulation of difference that is predicated on opposition and identity. Let me explain this a little. Remember, what Deleuze is trying to do is present a formulation of difference that is positive, a difference seen in itself and not through something else. As human beings, we have a tendency to see elements of the world by means of comparison, negation, and analogy. We see one thing through another. On a deep level, what does this impulse to ask why reveal about our approach to the world? For example, when we ask, why did you act like that? We are no longer dealing with the action itself, but are seeing it through a cause, and in doing so, reducing it to that cause. If we insist on conceiving actions through their causes, we block the possibility that an action could bring to the world something that is truly novel, truly different. It is always possible to see an action through a cause, always possible to draw a line backwards after the fact. But if we are set on doing this, we have already denied the possibility that the act could exist in itself as an expression of difference. Bergson understands this deeply, and it is part of his move to liberate the idea of freedom from notions of control and to reformulate it in terms of expression and creativity. Check out my series on time and free will for a deeper look at this. Now, all of this is not to say that we should never ask why. In many ways, this video is a response to the question, why difference? The point of endeavoring into the nature of the question why was to acknowledge the challenges we continually face in our tendency to think in ways that eradicate difference. I believe Deleuze's concept of difference allows us to think in ways we would have never known possible from the solid shores of representational thought. To end this video, I want to share a little of how thinking the thought of difference and seeing the movement of thought as a process of difference has deepened my experience of the world and opened up a realm for new possibilities of living. To attempt to think difference in itself is an exercise in thinking outside of our default mode of representational thought. These efforts can create cracks in the trenches of representation that habit has dug so deeply. After some time, or in the right conditions, these cracks can evolve into trickles and streams that erupt outside of representation and identity, flooding the conceptual divisions and revealing the reality of difference that lies beneath everything. This at least has been my experience, and is probably what happened in the event I described at the beginning of the video. To recap, what happens when the walls of representation are flooded? The world reveals itself in a vibrant array of novelty and creativity. The story we tell ourselves no longer diffuses experience by cloaking it in generalities. If we can let go of these conceptual distinctions and experience the world as it appears, the distinction between subject and object fades, and we become united with becoming. We are becoming. I want to be really careful here. I'm not saying read difference and repetition so that you can have a peak experience or a flow state. Attempting to have one of these experiences is a sure way to get tangled in knots of concepts and representation, many of them invisible. Rather than seeing these types of experiences as the goal, I'm trying to show how Deleuze's work is not isolated to the towers of academia, confined to technicalities and neologisms, but is relevant to the most fundamental aspects of our existence. I'm attempting to show how our experience of becoming in the world both opens us up to his ideas and is opened up by his ideas. This is all quite abstract. Aside from having experiences that nearly make us late for work, what does the affirmation of difference make possible? In many ways, it makes possibility itself possible. We constantly judge the world by seeing it through other things. We are set on asking, why am I doing this? What is this for? This will lead to that. That person is a... That we shield ourselves from the immediate reality of a given situation, which we have shown is a realm of difference. The ground of difference is fertile and inexhaustible. It can give rise to things we could never have foreseen. Here's a practical example. As a painter, I can easily get into the mindset of seeing my painting as a means to an end, and in doing so, the act of painting itself gets reduced to these ends. If I take the question why paint too seriously or too representationally, I limit myself to what I already know, to create this mood, to get into this gallery, to learn this. But paint itself provides an unlimited number of possibilities. If I embrace these possibilities, the question why paint might change into something like, what can paint do? And if I affirm difference, I must admit that I cannot know in advance what paint can do. So it becomes clear that this question might be better asked by doing, by experimentation and play. Who knows what is possible? There is always more. I will leave you with a popular quote from Deleuze and Guattari's book, A Thousand Plateaus, that echoes this sentiment. This is how it should be done. Lodge yourself on a stratum. Experiment with the opportunities it offers. Find an advantageous place on it. Find potential movements of deterritorialization, possible lines of flight. Experience them. Produce flow conjunctures here and there. Try out continuums of intensities, segment by segment. Have a small plot of new land at all times. Alright, thank you for watching. Before I go, I want to emphasize that this video is an attempt to share with you how this concept has played a part in my approach to life, and I hope it inspires others to feel the beauty and freedom I have felt from this concept. In taking this approach, much had to be simplified, although I tried to be as thorough as I could. There is much more to Deleuze's concept of difference than I was able to cover here, but I hope that this video demonstrates some of the possibilities that his thinking has to offer, and inspires you to go deeper yourself. In the notes below, I have some of the books I've found most helpful in approaching Deleuze's masterpiece, Difference and Repetition. Along with books about Deleuze, by Deleuze, and books that influenced Deleuze, I've included one of my favorite books, What Painting Is, by James Elkins. This book has no evidence of being directly influenced by Deleuze's thought, but is for me a profoundly beautiful exploration of oil paint that does not seek to represent it. Rather, it embraces the idea that paint itself is a set of inexhaustible possibilities. A rare case of a book on painting that approaches the subject from the side of difference in itself. Hope you enjoyed the video.